Assalamu Alaikum, everybody. My name is Amy Ducray. I'm the staff attorney at CAIR Michigan. We're your local Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization, and we'd like to thank you for hosting us today to talk about what are the rights of both parents and students when it comes to attending public schools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about First Amendment freedom of speech rights, and Sister Nora is going to talk about what it looks like to be a Muslim in public schools. So before we start, I would just like to say one disclaimer that I have to give, and I have to give it at every talk. This is intended for informational purposes only, is not intended to be legal advice. If you have a specific legal question, we can talk about that offline, inshallah. So when we talk about our rights and what rights we have in school, we're really talking about constitutional rights. And it's important for people to understand that when we're talking about sending our children to K through 12 public schools or even public universities, that we are really talking about an arm of the government. The Constitution, the First Amendment, protects your rights against interference from the government. And the government, sometimes when we think about the government, we think about like President Joe Biden, or we think about law enforcement. We think about our governor, we think about our Congress people. But what we have to remember is that public schools are an arm of the government. They are paid for by our tax dollars. They are run by elected officials. In Michigan, school boards are elected members, which means all of the constitutional protections that you're afforded, you're also afforded in public schools. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that public school children do not check their constitutional rights at the door just because they're going to public school, and that they actually enter the public school with their constitutional rights mostly intact, and that as parents, you have the right to support and enforce your child's constitutional rights until they get to about the age of 16, and then they have the right to enforce their own rights. But also as parents, you have a right, constitutional right, to bring up your children in the way that you see fit. And this means that the school cannot interfere with your ability to provide your children with the religious education and morals that you believe in. So the one other thing I'd like to say is, when we come out and do these presentations, sometimes we get, questions about, well, who is protected by the Constitution? There's some kind of misunderstanding going around that the Constitution only protects U.S. citizens, and that if you're not a citizen, you have less constitutional protections. And that's simply not true. Every person who's found inside the United States enjoys full constitutional protection. And the U.S. Constitution uses the term persons. It doesn't use the term citizen. So it doesn't matter if you're here as a citizen, a lawful permanent resident, if you're here on an H-1B work visa, if you're here on a J visa for education, or even if you're undocumented. If you don't have what they say, quote unquote, legal status here, you still are afforded constitutional protections as long as you're inside the United States. So those are how our rights interplay with the public school system. And I'm going to turn it over to Sister Noor, who's going to talk about, kind of what that looks like. What does it look like to be a Muslim in public school, and what are the schools required to do to make sure Muslims have a fair and safe education in our public school system?
Assalamu Alaikum, everybody. My name is Noor Ali, and as Sister Amy said, I'm going to be talking about what schools have to provide us as students. So schools have to constitutionally provide a clean, safe place for your children to pray in. Typically, what this has looked like in the past is that they allow the kids to have like the back corner of their school library or a corner of the gym. Sometimes they even have, if they're lucky enough to have an actual room, like a reflection room where they dedicate it for people to perform prayer. However, the biggest issue that I've had with students and parents is that they don't communicate it with the teachers or with the school ahead of time. At the start of the school year, on picture day when they receive their schedule, or at the beginning of the school year when they have curriculum night, it's very important to be proactive and let your child's teachers know that their class falls during Dhuhr time, and for 5 to 10 minutes they're going to have to leave class, go perform wudu, and then perform salah. And it is also extremely important to communicate with your own kids that they don't take advantage of this time. So we've had instances where, a few kids use this opportunity to skip school or they roughhouse, and then they unfortunately ruin it for the other Muslim kids to pray. Obviously, they should not deny any student to pray, but please let your kids know that this is a very serious matter. They should perform their salah and go straight ahead back to class. Accommodations. Every year as well, our office is contacted in order to get Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, and depending on what sect of Islam you follow, Ashura off as well. I understand that, as Muslims, our calendar is based on the lunar calendar. We don't necessarily have set dates months in advance of when we know these holidays are going to be. But specifically in the case of Ramadan, within, a 2-week to a 1-week period, please let your child's teachers know and their principal know that your child will be missing school due to fulfilling their religious obligation of Eid. They're allowed to also get, it's not just the one day that, they can get off. If you want your child to have the 3 days off, this just needs to be communicated with the school. There's no reason why your child's institution should deny them to have those days off for the holiday. This also includes having an extension on assignments. This is why it's very important to let them know ahead of time so that when teachers are coming up with their lesson plan, they can keep the days of Eid in mind so that they don't plan important tests, exams, or large homework assignments. However, if that is the case where there are tests or there are homework assignments already set for that day, the teachers have to provide them an accommodation and give them an extension to turn those assignments in or perform a test at a different time, maybe the day before Eid or when they come back to school after Eid. During Ramadan as well, especially for students who are in middle and high school, their bodies they don't adjust to fasting as well as adult bodies do. It's very important to also send a letter to your teachers at the start of Ramadan or a week before Ramadan, letting them know that for that entire month, your child is going to be a bit more exhausted and may need some extra time for assignments. And continued accommodations. Within the last 3 years, really since the onset of COVID, our office has gotten many cases in regards to gender-neutral bathrooms and also gender-neutral locker rooms. Depending on your district, depending on your school board may have voted on having gender-neutral bathrooms. What that means is, yes, anybody can go into the bathroom, whoever they are. If you are concerned about your child going into the bathroom, especially for our hijabi girls who are going in and who are fixing their hijab, and for somebody of the opposite sex to see them, your school has to provide an accommodation. What we've seen and what I've argued for with certain districts and certain schools is having single-user restrooms. Most schools have single-user restrooms, and they're typically reserved for the teachers, but that doesn't mean that your child can't use them as well. So they have to make an accommodation, especially if they know that there is a demand for it. If you are concerned about, why are there gender-neutral bathrooms, we'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about involvement within your school district and just overall involvement with the school board. But the same goes for, these accommodations go for as well with sports and in particular swim class. So if your child's swim teacher or PE teacher is making the argument that your kid can't wear a burkini, or if you have a Muslim boy and they're not allowing him to wear, like the long leggings, they can't do that. They can't prevent your child from not wearing those things in the class. They can't prevent them from not getting credit. At the very least, they have to provide like a different class for them to fulfill that requirement. But most cases, once you explain to them that modesty is a religiously obligated thing for Muslims, they have to accommodate that and allow your kid to wear modest attire. And for sports, your children are also, if there are uniforms or attire within the sports that are immodest, according to Islamic law, you are allowed to ask for a requirement to have long sleeve or long pants. In the classroom, again, depending on your district, depending on the AB classes, IB classes, depending on the teacher, there could be material being taught in classes that do not either align with Islamic values or that are anti-Islam. For instance, if you see up on the board, we have Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is a book that we have argued as part of CAIR Michigan to take out of certain curriculums in certain districts across Michigan. Why? It's because the material that is found within this book has targeted Muslim students because it essentially makes them defend their faith or seriously question their faith to the point where it's very troublesome. And the context of the book is never placed properly depending on the teacher or the district. They are not teaching the context in terms of the revolution and how these things have impacted the author herself. They sort of teach it in a way that it blames Islam as being like the evil, bad thing in the world. There can also be, like I said, school materials that do not align with Islamic values. We've had instances as early as elementary school where there have been picture books that depict certain things that we as a Muslim community do not necessarily agree with. And you as a parent have a right to ask the teacher of that classroom to not expose your children to that material. You have a right to take it up to the school itself, the principal, the school board, and say that this material does not reflect, my values, and I do not understand why it's being taught in this classroom. In that case where a teacher argues, oh, well, this is in my lesson plan, this is part of the curriculum set by whoever, they have to still provide an accommodation. They cannot tell you that your kid is going to fail if they don't read this book. They just can't. If you're having difficulties with getting certain material opted out of for your children, please contact our office and we can handle it as well.
So now I'm going to talk about free speech rights, and this is a very important topic right now, especially with what's going on in Gaza and in Palestine, and how much our youth is really, really engaged in what's taking place and having their voices heard with regards to the policies that are being set by the U.S. government. We've seen some fallout from high school students engaging in free speech on campus in a way that is quite frankly not constitutional. So the best defense is a good offense. So knowing your rights from the beginning really goes a long way, in my opinion. So as I said at the beginning, our students, our children, they enjoy their full constitutional rights when they enter the school district. And they have the right to express themselves. They have the right to have their views respected and heard. And they have their right to engage in assembling and addressing their grievances, which is the fancy language that's used by the First Amendment in the public school setting. So what that looks like is students can pretty much have the freedom to say what they want, with the exception of two exceptions in the high school setting specifically. And that is, the first thing is it can't be a threat. Threatening speech is never protected. It's always criminal. It's just is. And for public schools in the K through 12 school system, your speech cannot be disrupted to the learning environment. And what disruption to the learning environment means is that it actually causes a disruption. Like it interferes with somebody else's ability to learn and to function in the school environment. Is it enough that somebody's uncomfortable by your speech to claim that it's disruptive to the learning environment? According to the Supreme Court, no, it's not. Is it enough that your speech is offensive to your classmates to make it disruptive? According to the Supreme Court, it's not. Is it enough that you have an unfavored opinion about something to make it disruptive? It's not. Like, it actually has to cause a disruption. And there's much less protections in the public school setting for profanity. Like, if we're on the street, profanity is protected. If we're on the street, hate speech is protected. If we're on the street, lies are protected. Offensive language is protected. Unpopular opinions, hate speech, all of that is protected. In a public school setting, some of those things have a little bit of a less protection. One being hate speech. Hate speech is not protected for the most part in a public school. We're not allowed to use pejoratives or call people obscene names. and we are not allowed to like target people with our speech. So we can't harass other people with our speech, basically, in a public school setting. But other than that, you can say whatever you want. I know there's a lot of concerns because students have been engaging in walkouts, and there's been backlash in Bloomfield Hills High School. There's been backlash at Plymouth Canton Public Schools as a result of high school kids walking out. But I can tell you that school walkouts have been a traditional and long-standing form of protest for high school students before, like this. I know this generation thinks they invented everything, but I promise you they did not invent the walkout, and that's been going on even since the Vietnam War, and it's been accepted as a form of walkout. And I know that schools are saying this is not acceptable in our school. People are going to be disciplined in our school. We do not co-sign on walkouts. First of all, it's the government. They can never co-sign your speech anyways, so they're just talking, as the kids say. They just like to talk. So they can walk out. And I can tell you in Plymouth Canton specifically, they put out a letter the day after a walkout, and the walkout was beautiful. It was nice. They walked out in silence. They met somewhere else. They had nice speeches. Nothing offensive happened. And one person went to the school board and complained about how they had the terrorists walking out in favor of other terrorists, and it was offensive. And a knee-jerk reaction of the school was to send a letter saying, school walkouts are disruptive, people are going to be disciplined, we don't accept it. And then I did a quick social media search, right? In the last 2 years, Plymouth Canton High School has had 5 walkouts. Last year, they had 2 walkouts, one for gun violence, one for abortion rights, where the school set up a stage and they had administrators talking on the stage at a walkout. So, and that's what we call viewpoint discrimination. If you are being targeted, if your school is saying you can't walk out because what you're saying is offensive, or you can't walk out because you might make Jewish students uncomfortable by what you're saying, which is exactly what happened in Bloomfield Hills High School, that's viewpoint discrimination, and it is unconstitutional, and it is illegal, and we do not have to stand for it. We don't have to be on eggshells, right? We as Muslims, we like to be polite. We don't like to hurt people's feelings, but we don't have to be on eggshells when it comes to other people's feelings, when it results in us like losing a piece of our humanity, or losing our rights, or losing our voice, or losing our ability to stand up for an oppressed people. We don't have to do that, and we shouldn't subjugate ourselves this way. And your speech, in addition to protesting and walking out of school, if you walk out of school and you have a protest and you walk out of school, you actually have to leave the school, right? We have the right to protest in 3 places: on government property, but not inside the building. And sometimes a permit is required, so you need to figure that out before you do it. On every public sidewalk in the country, you're allowed to protest without a permit. And on private property, as long as you have permission to be there. So if you are engaging in a school walkout, or your student is engaging in a walkout at school or a school protest, you actually have to leave school grounds unless they have permission to have you gather a certain place on school grounds, which means you can't stand in the school parking lot. That's considered to be school property. You can't stand at the front door of the building, blocking access to the building. That's likely not going to be permissible. So you walk out to the sidewalk and you hold your protest on the sidewalk. That's where we protest, because every sidewalk in America is a public forum and you're allowed to protest there. It's considered to be a typical public forum, meaning that's the place for it, right? So, but in addition to protesting, what can we say in the classroom? We know that there's a lot of misinformation about the history of the Palestinian people that's coming out. There's a lot of silencing of certain language around the state of Israel, where they're calling it anti-Semitic to say that it's an apartheid state. They're calling it anti-Semitic to say that there's a genocide going on. So, and that's a definitive attempt to silence our speech, right? But if you're in a classroom and this topic comes up, you enjoy your First Amendment rights even in the classroom. Even if your teacher doesn't agree, even if your teacher doesn't like it, even if your classrooms don't like it, you have the right to talk about religion, you have the right to talk about politics, you have the right to talk about socially important and controversial topics, quite frankly. How we do it matters, though, right? We have the freedom to use our voice. The government can't stop us from using our voice. But we don't have the freedom from consequences of what we say. So when we live in a global society, how we say things and how we portray our message matters. So if we're saying things with the wrong tone, or we're saying things in a way that's disrespectful or rude or out of place, there could be consequences for that, right? We have to be using our voice in a respectful way. And I can promise you, you'll get your message across much better if you are being respectful about what you're saying. So tone matters, intent matters, and timing matters, quite frankly. But if you are in a classroom and your teacher's showing something, and this happened in a middle school where a teacher was showing CNN 10, and they were showing a lot of coverage about like what had happened in Israel on the October 7th. And then they were bypassing, images of the Gaza Strip after it was being bombed. And a student spoke out, and the student said, "This isn't fair. You're only showing one-sided. This is a classroom. We should be educating everybody about the entire circumstances." And then that kid was like removed from the classroom as being disruptive. I promise you that's not disruptive. That's within your right to say that. That's what educational discourse is for. It's to provide ideas, and the Constitution was put into effect specifically because the framers of our country understood that more discourse, more conversation, more free-flowing ideas from various and diverse viewpoints is always better. So our constitutional protections are framed around that. And in addition to like your right to say what you feel in your classroom, the Constitution protects your right to not have to say those things that you don't feel, which means you cannot be compelled to speak something that you don't believe. So that looks a lot of different ways. But in the context of our public school system right now, it looks like having to use somebody else's preferred pronouns. Like as Muslims, we know that the gender, the biological sex is determined at conception. There is no question about that. We know that there are only two genders because that's what's written for us. So we have seen punishment of students for refusing to use preferred pronouns of somebody that don't match their biological sex at birth. And I can tell you that that is unconstitutional and illegal. You can never be compelled to use something that is not in your heart and not within your own believing, especially if you have a religious objection to doing so. But does that mean we're going to harm other people with our words? That's not what that means. We're going to find a respectful, different way to address that individual so that they're not harmed, but we're respecting our own values as well. So that's how speech works. You can't be compelled to say things that are not on your mind, and you can't be stopped from saying those things that are on your mind as long as you're doing it in a way that doesn't disrupt your learning environment for other people. So the second part of the First Amendment really has to do with the right to assemble and address grievances with the government. And like I said at the beginning, our public schools are the government's. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, so I want to keep reiterating that. They are the government. So when things are happening at our schools that are affecting our students, affecting us in a negative way, our students are being othered, they're being silenced, they're not getting their rights, or like they have curriculum or books or what have you that are harmful to the moral and religious values that we're teaching our children, or just harmful to them and their identity, we have the right to go to the school board and complain about that. And we should be. And what we see is, like my mom used to tell me, like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? If your wheel's not squeaking, you don't know there's something wrong with it. So if we're not at the school board squeaking, the school board doesn't know that there's something that they need to change. And it doesn't make you a troublemaker. It doesn't make you problematic. We shouldn't be worried about how people are going to view us, because sometimes, like as Muslims, we're like that. We're like, well, what are they going to think if we complain, right? Well, they're going to think that we're here advocating for our students, which is our right. Michigan law, outside of the Constitution, the Michigan law has a specific provision that says parents are partners in education with the public school system. Partners. What does it mean to be a partner? It means that we work together to come to the best to the best outcome for our own children, right? We get input, they get input, we work together. So that's what they're going to think. They're going to think that you're doing what you're supposed to do as a parent. You see something that you don't like, you see something wrong, and you're addressing it. But this also means that our students have the right to do that too. And sometimes when something's affecting the students at the school, the best person to vocalize that is the students. This happened to me and I don't like it. And they have the ability to do that without being afraid of repercussions from the school system if they do so. So they have the right to go to the principal. If the principal doesn't take care of it, we have the right to go to the school board. If the school board doesn't take care of it, we have the right to go to the State Department of Education. And if they don't take care of it, we have the right to go to the Federal Department of Education, and so on and so forth, until we are being taken seriously and we are having our rights and our children are full citizens of the school system where their rights and their needs are being met. So we should be advocating. We want our students to be civically engaged individuals, and we should be advocating for them to advocate for themselves, because I promise you this generation of students is capable. They're willing and they're ready to do so. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sister Noor for, I think there's two topics left, where she's going to talk about about food service in school, and also what happens if we see curriculum or other materials in our school system that we don't appreciate.
Okay, so for food service in school, I know that, again, depending on the district, some school districts are still not providing halal meat for the students. Obviously, we know of districts that are providing halal meat already to their Muslim population, and the same should go to your school district as well. However, again, what I have seen is that these schools are unaware of the demand of how many people even want or need halal meat. So that means that as parents of these children and as students as well, going before the food service department of your district and letting them know that you would like to have halal meat, and this is how many people would benefit from having halal meat served in your school. In the case where they make an argument where they don't want to provide halal meat or it's too expensive or what have you, they have to provide a vegetarian option that is the same amount of calories as the non-halal meat option that other students eat. So if the other students are having, like a chicken sandwich for lunch and it's not halal, and they're arguing that they don't want to provide halal chicken for whatever reason, then they have to provide either, a fish equivalent or a vegetarian equivalent that has the same amount of calories for the students to have. Opt-out policies, so similar to what we discussed for the curriculum, so books like Persepolis, and also books that depict, same-sex relationships that you're not comfortable with your children being exposed to, you are allowed to opt out. Traditionally, parents have always been able to opt out of health ed or sex ed classes in the middle or high school level. The same applies to this as well. You go before your school, you ask the school for an opt-out form, you let them know why you're requesting an opt-out form. Religiously held beliefs are a perfectly fine reason. Don't be ashamed of that being the reason you put down, because that is protected. You are protected for having your deeply held religious beliefs. And if that's why you're not comfortable with your child being exposed to certain things, so be it. So your school district will provide you with an opt-out form, and you're able to let your kids get out of those certain curricula or lesson plans or classes. But again, just because you're getting opted out of, sometimes these teachers will, mark them down or something for missing an entire lesson. They have to provide a separate thing that can fulfill that requirement. So in the case of the book Persepolis, for instance, if you tell them, I'm not comfortable with my child reading this book because of the way it talks about our religion, they have to provide you with a different book that, is of the same reading level that your child can benefit from and do the same work on. And facing issues, We are, of course, here as an organization, as CAIR Michigan, we're here to serve you all. We're here to serve our Muslim community. And for anything that happens on the school district level, if your child or even if you as a parent are being discriminated against by school administration due to you being, Arab or Desi or what have you, and being Muslim, please come and report to our office. If your child is being put in a position in these classrooms where they have to choose between their GPA or defending their faith, please come to our office, because that is something that is very inappropriate for a teacher to put these children in, and they must be reprimanded. Schools are, unfortunately, higher administration, like principals, assistant principals, they're not aware of what goes on in these classrooms because they don't have their eyes on all of these classrooms at all times. So in the case that your child is being discriminated against by their peers or by their teacher, it's so important that the principal is made aware so that they can set out a reprimand that's appropriate for that teacher. And we've had instances where, like I said, Muslim parents themselves are being discriminated against within these own schools by these teachers, having certain remarks being made to them. If this is you and if you have been a victim of this discrimination, please also call our office, and that is something that we can work out for you as well.
I just want to add to, like, if your child is engaged in advocacy for Palestine on social media, at school, or in a discussion at school, and they're facing disciplinary proceedings or possibly being targeted by teachers for that advocacy, call our office. It's something that we've been engaging in for like the last 5 weeks a lot, and we are here and ready to go into the school and kind of address these scenarios, work with the school to come up with a better policy. Brother Daoud likes to say, and I think he gets it from his wife and he doesn't mind that I share that, but somebody's inclusion cannot be to our exclusion. So, and sometimes the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not really set up to discuss and deal with competing rights or competing interests. And schools are at a loss for what to do when there are competing rights, competing interests, and that's where CAIR Michigan comes in. And we can go in and we can discuss, why this might be inappropriate, provide some implicit bias training, and then, see if we can get a better environment for the kids at the school, inshallah. So I think with that, that's the pretty much the presentation that we have.